When you first start getting into astrology, you usually look into your sun sign first, and then the most obvious place to go after that is your moon sign. So what really does your moon placement really mean in the context, the wider context of your chart? Well, if that's your question, this is your video. So, what's in a moon placement? I'm going to start by giving you the short answer right at the start of the video. Your moon placement represents your basic needs, your unconscious instincts, and your sense of belonging. There's my short answer. If you want to stick around, here's the long one. So moon deities seem to have been worshipped going back as far back as history goes, essentially, and it seems to have nearly always been a goddess rather than a masculine god. Interestingly, if you go back to Neolithic, Paleolithic times thereabouts, it seems that the moon was quite often seen as more important than the sun, which also is interesting considering that the lunar calendar is certainly older than the solar calendar. If you consider that it's much easier to calculate the 28-day and run your life by the 28-day cycle of the moon versus the 365 days with the solstices and equinoxes and so on of the solar calendar. So considering that ancient peoples considered the moon perhaps as more important, that's actually a really interesting parallel to the moon being related to more our instincts and the sun being more like the person that we become, the person that we grow into. It's like the moon represents a part of us that's much more primal. Maybe it's actually like a deeper connection maybe, and it relates more to like our most basic needs. The physical moon, of course, directly affects the tides, which is very interesting considering that the moon is the ruler of Cancer, the sign of Cancer, and Cancer is a cardinal water sign. So water, archetypically in mythology and so on, tends to represent the feeling nature and also the more kind of feminine side of existence. So the moon then rules essentially your emotional needs, which, as I mentioned, is an archetypically feminine area. And of course, this is even more interesting considering that the 28 days of the moon cycle corresponds pretty strongly to that of the menstrual cycle. Very interesting when you consider these fast changes that the moon goes through, that obviously we see it as going through different phases because of the way that the shadow of the earth is projected onto the moon's surface, obviously. And this fast movement and the different phases tends to come up and be represented through different goddesses through mythology. So you can consider that there was Selene, Hecate, Artemis, and so on. They were all lunar goddesses, but like there wasn't just one that was like the whole moon because it was too complicated and it's too multifaceted. Also interesting is the progressed lunar return, which is an astrological phenomenon which takes roughly 27 years to complete one cycle. And if you consider the Saturn return, Saturn is very definitely a masculine archetype, that takes almost the same amount of time. Could be 27, 28, 29 years for the Saturn return. So it's interesting that they are very close in timing. So this means that if it takes 27 years for your progressed lunar return, that essentially your average human living to the average life expectancy is going to go through 3 lunar stages of their life, which corresponds very well to the stages of the maiden, the mother, and the crone, which are the 3 strongest aspects of the divine feminine and particularly lunar goddesses. And we consider with the waxing moon, the full moon, and the waning moon being those 3 stages. In a chart, of course, the moon is also very multifaceted, and something you can consider as that of a receptacle. Anything like a bowl or a cup or a vase, anything that contains water, all of these are ruled by Cancer. And there's various motifs in myths. For example, the witch's cauldron is a good example of that. The 3 witches are featured in the play Macbeth by Shakespeare, and they've all got this witch's cauldron. Again, very strong feminine images, and also the Holy Grail as well. And you consider Dan Brown in his novel about the Da Vinci Code? Sorry, I almost forgot the name. All about this Holy Grail being related to the divine feminine. Now, of course, that's largely a fictional novel, but I think that the mythology does hold very well. So more specifically in a chart, the moon can be a receptacle for past karma, and more specifically could be perhaps a receptacle for past karma relating to the relationship to femininity, or perhaps in a more grounded sense with a relationship to a mother figure in your life. We definitely live in a male-dominated society, and a part of that is the patrilineal tradition and so on, that the family fortune gets handed to the first son and so on and so forth. But in older traditions going back, and some that still survive today, such as Judaism, where the matrilineal, that is the line of succession going through the mother, those kind of traditions actually perhaps were older than patrilineal lineage. So the moon then has got more to do with, for example, the south node than the north node. It's got more to do with what is rather than what could be. That's more the realm of masculine energies and the sun and Mars and so on. The moon placement tends to be more static than it is dynamic. One last thing I want to mention about the moon placement is that archetypically it would be a mother, and I'm talking typically, stereotypically, obviously in modern life it's not anywhere near this simple, but archetypically you would suggest that it's a mother who raises a child, nurtures, literally feeds the child, literally carries the child, literally gives birth to the child, and so on. There's that expression though that it takes a village to raise a child. And it's like in childhood we learn how to socialize, right? So when we start to build up our habits, when we're a child, it's when we learn our language, it's when we get our accent, our customs, our culture, and things that are to do with our native country. It's like we become a part of something. I've been fortunate enough to live on 3 different continents, but for example, when I was living in Uruguay in South America, I was always Scottish, right? Like the imprint of my upbringing in Scotland has been left on me forever, and that's never really going to change. So that's really what I mean, is that your moon sign is like the part of you that belongs to something, and the part of you that is always going to belong to something. And I think that it will just stay with you forever and wherever. Okay, those are my thoughts on the moon sign. So thanks very much for checking out my video. If you want to see more of these kinds of videos, you can let me know by hitting the like button, hitting the subscribe button, and going even further if you fancy it, and leaving me a little comment. That would be very much appreciated. So I hope to see you next time. Cheers.